Hi, I'm Susan from Sunrise Quilt Studio. Today I'm working on the quilt that I made from my mother-in-law's vintage quilt blocks that I estimate are quilted from fabrics from the 1880s to 1910. And in this section I am quilting the outer border, and I decided to do a double channel piano key. And I marked the distance where I wanted the channels using a stencil and some pounce chalk, and I am using my vertical channel lock on my machine to keep my lines straight, and just taking my time and following those lines and getting all that quilting done. Now this is the pinwheel block, and I decided to do some cross hatching on the outer sections of the block. And this is a section that has some 4 patches and then just some 1 patches in it. And my intention at the beginning was to do a little more quilting than what this turned out to be. But I took into consideration my mother-in-law's preference, and she does not like dense quilting in her quilts. So I kept it to a minimum, enough to keep the quilt stabilized and have the quilting give it some definition. But there's no dense quilting in here. There's no heirloom type quilting in here at all. It's mostly all just straight line quilting. And I did use rulers for all of the quilting here. Now, I'm not an expert at dating fabrics, and I'm not a quilt appraiser, so I looked up online 1880s era fabrics, and these fabrics match really close to what I have in this quilt. And then I took the quilt to my quilt guild, and we have a group who focuses on vintage quilts, and I got their opinion, and they agreed with me that these quilt fabrics are from the turn of the century. So that kind of correlates to what my mother-in-law told me about these being made from her by her grandmother, so that would be about the right era. Now for the pinwheel in the center, I decided to do some curves, so I used a couple of different circle templates to make the curves along the seams, and I used a smaller, I believe this is a 3-inch circle here for the shorter seams, and then for the diagonal seams, which are longer, then I used a 5-inch circle. And this could easily be done freehand, but I wanted this to be more precise, so I used my rulers. Now another thing you could do, you could see here I'm going from seam to seam, and I'm changing the templates because the seams are different sizes. What I could have done was to quilt all the short seams first, and then do all the longer seams. And I did do that in one block, and it really didn't save any time, so I just did what was most comfortable for me. Now my little circle rulers all have those little tabs on the bottom, the gripper tabs, so that helps keep them in place while I'm quilting. And one thing I noticed while quilting this quilt, my extended base on my machine has been on there for about 8 years now, and it is starting to warp, so I'm going to have to take that off and see if I can get it straightened out, and if not, I'm going to have to replace it, because when I'm using small templates like these circles, I don't have as much trouble, but when I'm using my long ruler, it wobbles a little bit. So that's something I'm going to have to take care of here in the near future. Now for this block, this is the one that I had to enlarge because it was a 13-inch block, whereas the other blocks were all 15 inches. So I fixed that problem by putting a frame around it with some of the reproduction fabric, and that frame is 1 inch on all sides, and that takes up the space and makes it a 15-inch block. So I just stitched in the ditch around that frame to give that block a little more definition and make the piecing stand out. And I didn't do any quilting in that 1-inch frame at all. And here I'm using my larger ruler. This one is one I purchased at Linda's Electric Quilters several years ago. and it does a good job. It's a wider ruler. I have one that's a little bit narrower, but they're both the same length. And then later on in the video, I'm using a shorter ruler, and we'll get to that in just a bit. Now the next block, this is the Virginia Reel block, and this one I decided to do also the double channel outline stitch. It kind of emulates what I was doing in the outer border. And this is in the background, this is in the negative space, and I did it also on the blades of the reel. And using my larger ruler here, just taking my time stitching in the ditch, and then when I come up to the blade, then I line up that ruler right up against the seam line of the piecing and stitch my first row. And then once I get all the way around, then I'll stitch a 1/4 inch from that first stitching, and you can see that here in just a second. Now none of these blocks were complicated in their piecing or in the quilting, but since I used rulers for all of the quilting here, it did take longer. So that's one thing that you need to consider if you're quilting something and you're not wanting to spend a whole lot of time on it. Anytime you pick up a ruler, that is going to slow you down, and it is going to take more time. And there, that section is complete. Now the fabric in this block is mostly stripes except for the corners here, and this is also a shirting piece, and this corner I just did a single 1/4 inch outline in the corners of the block, hoping that would draw just more attention to the reel itself, the Virginia reel. Now on the 4 crowns block, I'm doing a 1/4 inch outline stitching in all the negative space, and doing that all the way around the block. And then I'll also do a 1/4 inch outline in the points of the crowns, and we'll see that in a minute. Now also in this little square, I'm also doing a 1/4 inch outline here. And then to get to one point to the other, I just stitch in the ditch around the piecing to get to where I want to go. And after I get all of this done on the outside, then I'll go to the center of the block and I'll do the negative space in the center there. Now this ruler that I'm using is by Handy Quilter, and it's called the Scalloped Edge Ruler, and this comes, I believe, in 3 different sizes, and this is the medium size that I have here. And I'm going to use that scalloped edge later on in the quilt. And here I am just doing the 1/4 inch outline and all the points of the crown. Just following real slowly here. We're being very careful on this quilt. The fact that it is my mother-in-law's quilt and that these blocks are so old, I was extra cautious with the quilting on this quilt. I was afraid if I had to do a lot of ripping out that things would fall apart, but the fabrics were in really good shape, and I didn't find any holes or any worn spots at all in these blocks, so they held up really well. Now the thread that I'm using, I decided to go with excuse me, a neutral tone, and this is 100% cotton thread by Signature, and Signature is made by American and Eford, and it's 100% cotton, and the color is baguette. So it's a taupey brown color, and it's a light brown, and it seemed to blend well with all the fabrics in this quilt. And for the center of the block here, I'm just doing some cross hatching, and the quilted lines are spaced 3/4 of an inch apart, and this scalloped edge ruler has the markings on it so that I was able to just follow along with that, just line up the marking to the stitching that I had done previously and then do the quilting, and it gave me a 3/4 of an inch spacing between those lines. And my quilting machine is on stitch regulated mode. I did not go on manual mode with this quilt. Everything was done on regulated, and my stitch length is 10 stitches per inch. I had a question, a couple of questions in the last couple of weeks from other quilters in my area, and one of the questions was, why do I use a 10 stitches per inch on my quilting? I did for years. I used 12 stitches per inch, which is pretty standard, but I didn't really like the quilting, especially when I'm doing light quilting like this. The stitches were too small. They didn't show very well, and if you're going to all the trouble in quilting something, you want your quilting to show. You don't want it to overshadow the piecing, but you do want it to show. So I like, on my machine, the 10 stitches per inch is better. And another question that I had was, again, on vintage quilts, do I feel like quilting these quilts is devaluing them? And my answer to that is no, because when I'm able to buy a top for $25 up to $50, the quilting I'm adding to them only adds to the value. It doesn't devalue them. And these aren't museum quality pieces. These are just everyday quilt tops. So I don't feel like I am devaluing them. I am actually adding value to them. And now they have a purpose. They are being used now. And I think that the quilters who pieced these blocks in these quilt tops had no intention of them sitting in storage for the rest of their lifespan. They were piecing these to be used, and even if I hand quilted these, I wouldn't get nearly as many done as I am now. I would probably still be working on my second or third quilt. And so there would just be more quilts out there that aren't being used and are just sitting around in storage and rotting away, and nobody is using them. Now this quilt I did was hesitant to quilt because these blocks are older than what I normally will quilt, but these are my mother-in-law's, and this is what she wanted, and so this is what I'm doing. So you just have to use your own judgment and go with what you feel in your gut is right for your quilt and your tops, and just stick to your guns. If you feel better just leaving them unquilted, then that's what you should do. But if you really want to quilt them and you want to machine quilt them, don't let anybody make you feel bad about that. You just stick to your guns and do what you feel is right. So that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and thanks for watching.